All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Wale Kunuji. I'm the director of the Lexlata Center for International Law and Comparative Constitutionalism in Africa. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this very important meeting today. The theme of this webinar, the role of constitution making in fostering peace and security in Africa, is a very timely one, considering the various conflicts going on today in several parts of Africa. The question that our speakers will be answering today is the extent to which constitution making can play a role in helping to address some of these conflicts. Our speakers are very experienced professionals with several years of experience in the field of constitution making, and I believe they are in advantage position to answer this question. I would like to express our gratitude to all our distinguished speakers and the moderator. Thank you very much for honoring our invitation. I will now hand over to Nneka Okechukwu, our distinguished moderator, to introduce the speakers and carry on with the webinar. Thank you. Nneka, over to you. All right, so please give us a few seconds. Let me connect with Nneka. I think she's not on this call right now, just to confirm what is going on. Please, I'm still trying to connect with Nneka. I'm wondering what is actually going on.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Hello. My apologies for logging on a bit late. I had a bit of technical difficulties getting online, but I am really happy to be here now. We are beginning today's seminar on the role of constitution making in fostering peace and security in Africa. I wonder, would Wale want to say a few words about the Lexlata Center before we begin?
I already did that, Aneka. Thank you. I already did that before you came
Oh, you
about.
already did that. Okay,
Yes,
then in
yes.
that case, we can already go directly into this. My apologies again from my side.
That's okay.
Um, then we can go directly into the keynote address from Christina. Christina Murray, if you would like to take over.
Right, thanks very much. And thanks for including me in this. I've been looking forward to it, and I must say your questions have made me start thinking a bit. But Wally, I'm afraid I'm not really going to answer the question to which constitution making can play a role in, sorry, let me just get my clock going, in enhancing peace and security. But instead, I sort of hope to provide something of a framework for the discussion, looking at what we've learnt about constitution making in sort of roughly the last 40 years, I suppose, since the enormous enthusiasm we saw at the end of the Cold War and so on. So I think many of us are still kind of really informed by those processes that were exciting and successful. My own country's process, South Africa, in the early 90s was, of course, famous because it marked the end of apartheid, and constitution making was central to that. Namibia is quite often forgotten, but its process around about then too was one that led to its independence and ended South Africa's occupation. Uganda carried out a really impressive process around about that time. Benin, of course, and a number of West African countries followed. So it was exciting times. I think the reality now is very, very different. I mean, by and large, there have been few successful constitution making processes recently. We, of course, saw a bit of a burst around about the time of the famous process in Kenya. It finally succeeded, and a couple of the Arab Spring processes. Um, but, many failures. Zambia's tried a number of times and not really got anywhere. Tanzania had quite an elaborate process that ended with no change. I think many of us were quite hopeful about the Gambia after President Jammeh left office, but that process seems to have kind of run out, perhaps. And similarly in Botswana, a process that started in 2020 has not managed to reach fruition. So we see a lot of problems, I think, in constitution making processes, full stop, whether or not they are going to contribute to peace and security. And I think it's important to think about what we've learned from the processes, what has made many processes good and strong, and experiences we can draw from them, but also what makes them falter and perhaps fail. So I wanted to touch on some of those things. But sort of as I suppose as a starting point, why do we even think about what are constitutions' role in peace and security? And I mean, for countries moving from conflict, I mean, we'll often see some form of transitional constitution, maybe just a constitutional declaration, as a mechanism to get people from the battlefield, you might say, to the table, to talking rather than fighting. And some form of constitutional arrangement is often important there. We saw also in Tunisia, for instance, sort of transitional constitution that took them through the process. And quite interestingly, I think at the moment, what's going on in Syria is interesting because a sort of unilaterally imposed constitutional declaration may succeed in providing a basis for building stability there. That, of course, waits to be seen. But in more stable conditions, of course, constitutions regulate access to, let me call it power, to the responsibilities of running government and so on. Agreed rules of how people can access power and how they should behave when they bear those responsibilities are critical. And there are many other issues to think about when we think about what a constitution might do to contribute to a more stable society. For me, the most important one is probably the rule of law. That a good constitution can provide is actually the basis for a country that runs according to the rule of law. And the rule of law, of course, can help protect human rights, can protect people against arbitrary rule if the constitution is properly implemented, can be the basis for effective institutions that are not abusive, as so many of our institutions are. And that also may mean building that people trust government more, and then to connect slightly to questions of conflict, are less likely perhaps to support insurgencies and to support a government, democratic government, in protecting security rather than sort of giving up and going with movements that claim to promise more. So perhaps stronger state institutions based on the rule of law may help defend countries against such violence. Anyhow, so that's a little bit of background. What about constitution making itself and what we might have learned in the last 40 years? I mean, Namibia and South Africa really do show that a strong constitution-making process can be a vehicle for introducing a strong democratic system. Those are just two examples. And I think a good constitution-making process can also help increase the accountability of democracy. And despite its problems at the moment, I think Kenya is an example of that, that the process has strengthened the democratic processes in Kenya. But we've also, over the years, developed a better understanding, I think, of what makes a more credible constitution-making process. You know, gone are the days in which a bunch of people, well, not entirely, but in democracies at least, gone, or in countries striving to be democratic, gone are the days when a bunch of people make up a constitution and then it's adopted. Not that that hasn't happened recently. If I'm not mistaken, Guinea is a good example of that. But we don't expect that in democracies. What do we expect? We expect a constitutional process to be thoughtful and deliberative, open to hearing many ideas. We expect a constitutional process to be transparent. And in fact, one of the things that seemed to have been a major stumbling block in Botswana was the absence of transparency in that process. A lot of criticisms about it on that regard. So thoughtful and deliberative, transparent, inclusive. And one element of inclusiveness is having sort of, you know, all relevant parties, and of course we can talk about what that might mean, it's complicated, engaged in decision making. And then, of course, a credible public participation process. And here I'm sort of thinking of inclusion as parties kind of at the table, more or less, and public participation being a broader aspect of engagement in constitution making, just to try and distinguish the two. So, and public participation is often the thing that the broader public, civil society, emphasizes greatly. But another thing we've learned from constitution making over the last 30 years, 40 years, is that a constitution making process, if it is to lead to a constitution that is implemented, can't be people driven. Can't be people driven, at least if that term is taken literally. And I know that this is going to be controversial, or is often controversial. I mean, you'll all know that that slogan, people driven, was the sort of dominating slogan in the wonderful process that the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission carried out in the early 2000s. And it was indeed an astonishingly strong process of public participation which in my view led many Kenyans to a greater understanding of government and the role of government and constitutional matters. And certainly at that time, the call of many civil society groups and NGOs and perhaps individuals was to try and keep politicians out of constitution making. But that process failed. And I think it's agreed that one of the reasons it failed was, in fact, the absence of elite consensus on the draft that was produced by the Commission proposal, or the Commission-led process, I should say, and the absence of consensus on the draft that finally went to the referendum, which basically was a government draft. So the failure of some kind of elite consensus on either of those drafts was, I think, a major cause for the failure of the process. And much more worryingly, really, it's also often argued that the bitterness around that battle, and particularly around the referendum in 2005, actually was a major contributor to the violence after the elections in 2007. So that's an argument, one argument for the point that elite pacts are essential. I think the process in Chile recently is another example, just one other of many examples of that. And it's notable that the second process in Kenya, incidentally, that did lead to the successful adoption of a constitution gave a significant role to politicians. Okay, so that to me is a very sobering lesson from constitution making over the last sort of 20, 30, 40 years, that an elite pact of some sort is essential. And I mean, there's a less cynical way of looking at that. I mean, I think I might have presented it fairly cynically. Basically, slightly less cynically, one can say that the politicians are going to have to implement the Constitution. And if they're not on board, that's not likely to happen. Some people also actually argue that politicians understand the politics better. You probably wouldn't buy that. But it is something to consider. And of course, at the same time, public participation in itself is not particularly democratic. I mean, public participation is, one would hope, a part of a flourishing democracy. But I think it's quite hard to argue that a public participation process on its own is a sort of purely democratic process. You may argue that politicians are more likely, and this depends on many other things, to actually represent people. So I think you need an elite agreement, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't have, or doesn't mean that some form of public participation isn't perhaps essential. And we've seen some, as I said, really good public participation programs. They give constitution makers a much better understanding of what's going on in the country. And from the point of view of the people involved, they allow them to engage. They actually also serve important educational elements and provide an enormous and unusual opportunity for that, explaining how government works. And I think, and this may even have happened to some extent in South Africa in the early days, they can provide an example of what real democracy should look like, a process of listening and responding to people, not the kind of top-down stuff that most of us get. So for me, what's particularly valuable about public participation may well be the way they model future democracy. But of course, they can be hugely divisive, and that's a real problem with them. And in designing a constitution-making process that's intended to build stability and peace, that really needs to be taken into account. One reason for their stability, of course, is that the stakes in constitution-making are incredibly high. People will believe that they have a lot to lose. And of course, the people involved in public participation, as you'll all know, are really very, very seldom politically neutral. They're often, perhaps usually, partisan. Sometimes they're just party members presenting party views. Quite often they may be sort of individuals actually enlisted by parties to present views as if they're individual views, but actually are just party views. And the movie Democrats, which some of you may have seen, which is about the Zimbabwe process of 2010, provides a really quite harrowing example of how political participation can be manipulated. It contains, I think, some good lessons for us all. So there's that element. Submissions to public participation are often coordinated, which on one hand can be good, on the other hand is a little bit dangerous. People tend to see them then as sort of numbers counting. They'll argue that, you know, the more people that say something, the more reason to accept it. Public participation becomes a rather badly run public poll. And I think I personally would resist the idea that public participation should be seen as a sort of majoritarian exercise. In part because, of course, especially again in countries that are fragmented to some extent, have experienced instability, a constitution-making process, we would usually hope, is a mechanism for inclusion rather than division. It's not for majority decision-making, it's for some form of more consensual decision-making. And that's a reason, I think, for avoiding the idea that public participation is a sort of poll. So how does one do that? We've learned also that managing expectations is an enormously important part of a constitution-making process. It's hard. It applies particularly to public participation. People won't see all their views reflected in a constitution. And there are ways of addressing that, but they need to be attended to. And of course, to go back to the less popular point, if we accept that elites are going to need to make many of the decisions, public needs to be aware of that too. That in large part, important elements of a constitution are going to be elite-driven. So that's one little bit. I don't think one can end talking about the role of public in constitution making, though, without just a word about referendums. Because we more and more see referendums involved in constitution making processes. And I suppose they're expected because they're seen as a sort of ultimately democratic moment where you can sort of determine whether a constitutional proposal is actually accepted or rejected. But of course, again, as you're probably all aware, they're actually more complicated than that. A referendum's more complicated than that. Constitutions are complicated documents. People have to vote yes or no usually, so that's quite problematic. Oftentimes, people may reject a constitution because they don't like one or two provisions, whereas the overall constitution has sort of been a compromise that actually may overall benefit the country. But then more complicated is that just requiring a simple majority, that's quite often the case, or even sort of regional majorities, could lead to the adoption of a constitution in a referendum that doesn't pay attention to the interests of marginalized or minority groups. And I think that's a real danger of a referendum. And so if consensus hasn't been reached before a referendum, it can, as happened in the case of Kenya in 2005, I believe, lead to more fragmentation and division rather than building the country. So I suppose one could say that if one needs a referendum, it should be preceded by real deliberation, consultation, and consensus. It's then not a substitution for consensus, a substitute for consensus, but it is a kind of form of formal confirmation or endorsement of the agreement. Okay, if I've got a few more minutes, I'm sort of rather losing track of the time, but
I believe we're right at 20 minutes for your presentation. You can take a couple more minutes to round up.
Couple more minutes for the most complicated issue. So I should perhaps have talked a bit less about the people and a little bit more about this. Post-conflict constitution making, where the real critical issue, just in summary, is that very, very often, and I think Katrine may well touch on this a bit when she talks about Sudan, South Sudan, or Sudan, or both, is that very often we're in a situation where there's a peace agreement, and those peace agreements include constitutional elements. They may be transitional elements, the power sharing agreement. They may be elements committing to the longer term. And the simplest example of that would be where in an internal conflict, a group has won an agreement for greater autonomy. So those are agreements that would need, in many cases, to be inserted in a new future constitutional arrangement. That, of course, ties the hands of future constitution makers. And there is, in short, something of a paradox there. You're making you're trying to make a constitution in what might be presented as a democratic process, but the hands of the constitution makers are tied. In South Africa, we got away with that, with considerable constraints on our main constitution-making process, I think because of the enormous credibility of the parties that negotiated that initial deal. So there was then at least acceptance of that set of compromises. It's not always as easy as that. Some of the elites involved in the agreement will not have been elected, of course. Many honest elected politicians will have been excluded from the peacemaking process, which is often hardly inclusive. And some of those agreed in a peacemaking agreement will be like the South African apartheid government or the old autocrats. They'll have limited autocracy. So there's a limited legitimacy. So there's a real problem there. It's worth having a look, and I won't go into this too much now, at the way the scholar Andrew Arata tackles this quite complicated problem. And he, I think, and I'm not going to do him justice perhaps, moves really or argues that we can't so much talk about democracy in these contexts, but the legitimacy of the process. And he sees this, again, I worry that this is a bit of a crude summary, but I think what he does is he sees legitimacy as sort of having two sides or two aspects, at least in a very much more subtle argument. The one would be a level of pragmatism, and that's the acceptance of this elite deal or the peacekeeping deal that you have to do. But he suggests there has to be an element of what he calls justice as well. The proposal that is presented to the people, that is adopted, needs to be what we could loosely call a good proposal, a proposal that incorporates justice. So legitimacy, he argues, might be secured through that balance of pragmatism and justice. And that, he would argue, is a way of overcoming the sort of democratic dilemma, actually, in any constitution-making process, because you have to agree on the process, but particularly in these post-conflict or processes emerging from autocratic rule. Okay, a lot more to say, but thank you. I'm sorry if I've eaten up too much of the time.
Thank you very much, Christina, for your keynote speech, which has delivered quite a number of controversial points that we can also go into in further details. Not a problem at all. I think you are quite right on time at this moment. And perhaps I would also give our audience an overview of what is to come. We will have a panel discussion between Dr. Catherine Scher, Dr. Adam Abebe, and Jan Schmidt, where we will cover some of the points that were raised by Christina, and Christina would also have the opportunity to respond to them. And then after a little bit, we will also open the floor to questions from the audience. In the meantime, if there's anything burning issue that you would like to address or put forward to the panel, please write that in the chat as well, so that we can also, I will keep an eye on the chat, and I can also introduce this into the conversation if needed. I also, it was remiss of me, I did not introduce myself at the start of this. My name is Nneka Okechukwu, and it's a pleasure to actually moderate this discussion. So at this point, I will start the panel discussion, and I'll ask the panelists to respond to the main points from, I mean, Christina covered well, constitution making is in itself such a massive undertaking, and it covers many areas, including public participation and elite buying. And Christina has touched on a bunch of this. Perhaps we can start with Catherine. Catherine, would you have any comments, immediate comments to Christina's presentation? And Christina might also want to respond to the comments of the panelists as well.
Thank you very much, Nneka, and also thank you to the hosts of this webinar for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and especially a pleasure to be with my friends and colleagues, Christina, Adam, and Jan. And thank you, Christina, for your insightful keynote speech, which raised a lot of issues, obviously, a lot of points that could be further discussed. But I think in many ways, we all agree that a democratic constitution-making process is not simply about drafting a document. It's about much more than that. It's about building really a foundation for a just and inclusive state and society, and has to somehow encounter and contain key aspects such as inclusivity, participation, public outreach was mentioned, access to information. The process has to be transparent, must give the people a chance to deliberate and to find consensus, reach consensus on fundamental principles and specific provisions. And while we list these various key aspects of a democratic constitution-making process, I think it's important for us to also look at the practice of it and what it turns out in reality often to be less than perfect, and leading to a number of failed constitution-making processes. It's interesting to look at countries, for example, that have undergone several of these processes, and there are recurring elements in all of these processes where you think, have they not learned from their history of constitution making? Look at Kenya, for example. Christina outlined this example. And then we have constitution making processes which are always kind of referred to as great examples of constitution making, like the South African process, which is so often referred to in different contexts as a really successful constitution making process in the early 90s. So I think it's very hard and difficult to, first of all, speak about key aspects of a constitution making process, but then looking at the reality of these processes and the complexity of these processes. I mean, specifically in post-conflict countries, you have also the need for an elite bargain. You have the need for a political agreement to precede a constitution-making process, be it in a part of a peace agreement, be it elsewhere. But and that is often the first challenge that arises in such contexts. So the reality of constitution making, I think, is a lot uglier than the theory of it, and involves a high degree of complexity, which obviously is something that we should all be very aware of.
Thank you very much for this comment, Catherine, outlining the difference between the principles that we often discuss and the reality of constitution making that we often see, that we see in a number of jurisdictions around Africa. Before I give the floor to Christina to respond to this, perhaps we can also hear from the other panelists. First Adam and then Jan. Speaking on the principles behind democratic constitution making, and also to the points that were raised by Christina in her keynote.
Thank you very much, Neka, and thank you very much also to the organizers. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's always a pleasure to also listen to Christina. I see her quite often, and I talk to her quite regularly. But every time I hear her and discuss some of these big issues, I find it really interesting and very informative. Also good to see, as Katri said, it's good to have friends and former colleagues speak on these issues. So going to the key points, I think I was initially thinking about it, and I wasn't sure about it, but when Christina started mentioning it, I thought it was important to discuss it, which is that what do we mean by democratic, right? In the normal discourse, we mean that people should participate either directly or indirectly, but ultimately the dominant political force or the political force that has the majority support decides, right? But constitutional frameworks are supposed to regulate the democratic game, right? And so, do we expect that process to be democratic if it's supposed to actually regulate the democratic framework that is supposed to come afterwards? And I think that should inform our understanding of what democratic means, which leads me to some of the ideas that Christina and Katrina identified. What I think has increasingly meant, and I think justifiably so, is that you cannot get away now, at least if you want to claim that you are following a democratic process, to draft a constitution and then push it through and adopt it, right? And so there has to be some kind of public participation. But the key element, and I think Christina emphasized that, is the elite consensus. Fundamentally, I think while there are basic principles that we believe and we want constitutional frameworks to advance, they also have to reflect the deliberativeness, the consensus, the compromise, and the bargain, right? And so it's not just that they outline what is important, what is ideal, but they reflect a compromise, a bargain, a pact. And so I think we need to unpack what we mean by democratic from the very beginning. And I say that because I think in a lot of the constitution making process that we see, because of the demand to make it democratic, there's an excessive overburdening of the process. And so constitution making processes tend to take really, really long. They are expensive. And in that process, what happens is that the constitutional moment, the urgency that makes the demand for constitution making important is lost, which ultimately then leads to a situation where I wouldn't necessarily call it a failure, but the inability to actually have a document, right? And so you can't, just because there's no constitution, it doesn't mean the process has failed necessarily. But I think not getting into a constitution is obviously the main objective. And so I think we need to start thinking perhaps in a more pragmatic, as Christina encouraged us to do, in a more pragmatic way, so that the desire to make a process democratic does not lead to the overburdening of the process and therefore the missing of constitutional movements. And I think looking at what happened in the Gambia, it started at a very high moment where there was a sense of public consensus on what needs to happen, a sense of political consensus on what needs to happen. But then there was quite an extensive public participation process that ultimately kind of took the edge out of that urgency and allowed the political forces to renege on the promises and commitments that they have made. And I think I would argue, and maybe Katrina can speak to it later, that what happened in South Sudan is in a way also that, right? So there was a movement, an opening to have a new constitutional framework, but because of a desire to make it very extensive and elaborate and inclusive, we may have actually lost that moment that ultimately then drags the entire process forward. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much for this contribution, Adam. I'm highlighting the necessity for a constitutional moment, so to speak. Jan, if you would like to take the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nika, and thank you so much also for the invitation to the organizers, to Vole, and of course to you, Nika. It's a great pleasure and a true privilege to be invited to this webinar and to follow even now Christina's remarks. I can only repeat what Adam was saying. Christina is a true inspiration, I think, for us who are involved in constitution making support, especially in Africa. And she has always super interesting analysis, and her analysis is always spot on, and also her keynote now for this webinar, I think, is spot on. And I can actually confirm most of the points that she raised. I mean, now coming after Catherine and Adam, we have looked at it a bit more from a general perspective. Maybe I can just come in and give an example from for the audience from a more pragmatic or practical point of view. I was involved in the Somali constitution making process for many years, and I think most of the points that Christina raised are actually, it's really funny because it creates immediately flashlights from the Somali case and from the Somali process, and what worked well and what didn't work so well. I mean, maybe just for the audience very quickly, as you know, Somalia engaged in a constitution-making process after a decade of political anarchy, complete government failure, and turmoil. So coming out of conflict, and so we were talking about constitution making in a post-conflict scenario. And actually, in this process, participation played an extensive role. Yeah? I mean, despite perceptions and other narratives very often in the Somali process, there was an extensive public participation process in the Somali constitution making process conducted between 2010 and 2012. But especially this public participation process didn't make the process democratic at all. I mean, I think there was only at that time the only democratically legitimized institution that was existing at that point in time in Somalia was the Transitional Federal Parliament. Along the process, the Transitional Federal Parliament was completely disregarded, was completely sidelined, and the process was then put in the hand of a small elite that was basically empowered by mainly by international actors, not so much by Somali people, or by
Sorry, Jan, I think we're having problems hearing you. I don't know if I'm the only one experiencing that, but we're having problems hearing you.
Politicians.
Jan, are you there?
It was basically the point, the president, the prime minister, the speaker. Is it better now? I'm in France.
Now,
can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, it's better now. Thank you.
You lost me?
And if you would, yes, we lost you for a few seconds. So if you can repeat your last two sentences, that would be very appreciated.
Perhaps you could do without the video if it helps.
Yeah, that might also help if you turn off your video, and then it might help with your internet connection. Jan, are you still with us? Perhaps at this point we can give...
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, all right, great. Yes, we can hear you.
Still not? Hello, hello?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I was just saying that yeah, in the hand of a small group of political elite. Delay now, yeah. Then you know, after the sidelining of the parliament, it was basically a small group of political actors that negotiated on the constitution. And not only did they sideline the parliament at that time, but also, unfortunately, the results of the extensive public participation process. So many points of the input that they received from the Somali public didn't make it actually in the constitutional text. And indeed, the provisional constitution that was adopted then in 2012 by a constituent assembly is rather a political elite pact than democratically or participatory document that reflects the ambitions of the Somali people. But I mean, what I want to say is that nevertheless, of course, maybe at that time, this was also what was needed to advance the Somali state building process. I mean, since the adoption of the 2012 provisional constitution, Somalia has made tremendous progress also in terms of state building. They have now a recognized government, internationally recognized government. A lot of progress has been made. Somalia is now a more respected actor also again in the East African community now, joining it within IGAD and also having strong partners now from outside the region, from Egypt and Turkey. So a lot of progress has been achieved internationally, but also within Somalia, based on this political pact that was reached in 2012. Unfortunately, there are, of course, still many problems, particularly related to the new federal system that was established, which came out of this political pact. But I would there maybe echo also what Christina highlighted, that in such a post-conflict scenario, most likely a more pragmatic approach to constitution building is required in order to advance out of conflict, and political elite pacts maybe have to prevail over certain broader democratic principles and public participation ideas. I think the Somalia case is a good example where actually, even despite of all the shortcomings, at least tremendous progress has been reached also in terms of state building and in Somalia and institution building. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, Jan. Your comment, using a pragmatic example from Somalia to actually highlight the point made earlier on by Christina as well, that a more pragmatic approach is needed, more pragmatic viewpoint is needed going into constitution making processes. Christina, I was wondering, would you want to respond to these comments? Or should we go further in questions to the panel?
Can you give me one sort of minute to respond? Because
yes, please.
I mean,
you can pick two if you want.
There seems two. Well, and I'll probably take three. There seems to be a sort of general level of agreement here, and I thought really well put by Katrine in her description of practice being uglier than the theory, which is a sobering way of looking at it. And then when Adam talked about the sort of, in a sense, I don't like the idea of constitutional moments very much, and I seem to recall, Adam, you don't either much, but the idea of losing that impetus is a really real one. And I even saw it in South Africa, as the ANC, for instance, got more involved in governing during the constitution making process and a little bit less interested in curtailing in a constrained government. And that was just in 2 years, in a fairly idealistic process. And it's often also led me, these problems have often led me to argue, really, you know, should we be looking at large-scale constitution making at all? Shouldn't we, as far as possible, just be doing amendments? Just grab what you can. I mean, that may have worked a bit in Gambia, for example. Grab what you can. And of course, the response to that often will be that people believe that a constitution making process will build the nation, will secure peace and stability, and of course that a robust process will increase the legitimacy of the constitution. Now, to be a bit cynical about that as well, I'm not actually sure to what degree a constitution making process can and does do those things. I mean, certainly it may be that the legitimacy of the process will give a constitution legitimacy to start off with. I don't know how long that lasts. I think quite soon people start asking for delivery and are less sort of alert to the constitutional struggle how difficult it was to actually, and Kenya's again a good example. I mean, it was an enormous struggle to get that constitution-making process going. South Africa to some extent too. So, part of the question is, are we also overly idealistic about what one of these elaborate processes can deliver? And given the challenges we know, should we be less idealistic? Now, amendments don't need the exclusion of public participation and so on. One can, of course, have various processes, but just to throw another thing into the discussion.
Thank you, Christina, for giving us this food for thought as we go into the panel discussion. Yes, I'm actually questioning whether we might actually want to focus on amendments rather than constitution making, which is certainly something we should keep in mind as we go into this panel discussion. But I have some questions for the panel, and then I will open the floor to the audience. But beginning with Adam, seeing as this webinar is actually focusing on fostering peace and security in Africa through constitution making, my question is, can constitution making actually help to address root causes of violence and exclusion? When we think of places like Sudan, the Sahel, we have Sudan with the parallel constitution that's taking place. So what would you say to these happenings that are occurring, constitutional processes?
Thank you very much again, Neka. And so the Sahel, from Sudan to Guinea, especially the core of the Sahel, is a very complicated, very difficult area with very, very diverse actors, very contradictory interests and ideas. And in that context, I think having a proper, acceptable constitutional framework is critical. And so obviously it cannot solve all the problems, but I don't think the Sahel and the countries that are now going through various problems will be able to address them without having a process where they can agree on the nature of the state, what kind of state they want to have, and of course the kind of government that they want to establish. And so it's not the magic wand, it's not sufficient, but I find it absolutely necessary in the Sahel, and I would argue anywhere else, that the resolution of conflict, the transformation of conflict, requires a deliberative, thoughtful process to agree on a settlement of the nature of the state. Do we need a religious state? Do we want a federal state? Do you want a secular state? Do you want a socialist state? What kind of state do we want to imagine? I think that's critical. And of course, the kind of government. Do we organize it in such a way that power would be based on elections or some other form of legitimate authority, or should we centralize power or distribute across the country? So I don't think the Sahel, and I would argue anywhere else, will be able to extract itself out of the quagmire it finds itself in without a political settlement that necessarily entails a constitutional settlement. Now, of course, the major challenge I think in the Sahel is that constitution making happens in a particular conception of the state and a particular conception of democracy, right? You cannot think of a constitution without the state. Now, the challenge in the Sahel in particular is that there are actors that reject that idea of state, right? And so how do you deal with those actors? Which is, some of the jihadist groups actually imagine a state or a political entity beyond the state, right? And how do you then, how do you deal with actors like that in a constitution-making process? Very, very difficult. And the same also about the democratic nature of the government that we tend to take for granted. Some of these actors tend to focus on legitimacy, right? And so democracy is one form of legitimacy. And we can disagree on whether whatever they are proposing is legitimate, but I think they imagine a government beyond the democratic way of constituting it that we tend to take for granted. And so, it is important, and I said it's an absolutely necessary element of getting the Sahel out of the problems, out of the troubles that it is in now. And it is desirable to do it that way. And at the same time, I think the presence of actors that question the very idea of a state within which constitution making happens, and also the democratic nature of government that the African Union, that ECOWAS, and in general the world community has advanced, creates, I think, its own unique challenge that's unique to the Sahel.
Thank you very much, Adam, pointing to the wider difficulties of the situation or contextual issues that arise in the Sahel, making constitution making it even more challenging than it is in normal circumstances, I would say. Jan, if you're still with us, I have a question for you, if that's okay. And that is with regard to constitutional frameworks or constitution making in deeply divided societies. You already touched on the point of Somalia and gave us that example. But how can we then make this more inclusive and peace promoting? Or is it even something that we desire when you point to the fact that elite activities actually helped in a way in pushing forward the process, even though public participation wasn't quite as inclusive as wanted or as initially desired?
I mean, let me come to maybe first to the constitutional framework question. I think, of course, in constitutional design, there are several ways actually that have developed now over time, how to help also deeply divided societies to create more inclusive and viable political solutions and state building solutions. I think maybe if I start with some principles, I would always recommend to first prioritize conflict management over winner-take-all scenarios. I think we need to work towards proportionality, try to establish a division between shared rule and self-rule in a country, and provide also for mechanisms and procedures that allow for peacefully renegotiating also the political deals that were concluded before. So basically also to echo what Christina was saying and suggesting with constitutional amendments, that maybe at a certain time it's important to lock in certain successes and then allow also in the constitutional design to move forward further with constitutional amendments and refinements. And basically that was also the case in Somalia, where the provisional constitution deliberately left certain things open that were not able to agree upon in 2012, and provided now for a process of review and for a continuation of the process, which was then ironically placed again in the hand of the parliament, the very same institution that was sidelined in the constitution making process. I think maybe when it comes to constitutional design, also I have maybe some recommendations also for certain design questions. I think I touched already on it, that I would always, especially in post-conflict scenarios, maybe avoid election systems which create winner and loser scenarios, or overemphasize winner and loser scenarios. So first past the post, maybe not the...
Jan, unfortunately, we're having audio issues again. Perhaps you would want to switch off your video again.
Desired electoral system in such circumstances. You should think more about proportional representation, or maybe even ideas like preferential voting, which allows and also intergroup voting in certain cases.
Unfortunately, I think the audio is still quite bad. Jan,
off. I hope the sound is back. Is it?
No,
can you hear me?
it's
With the presentation,
cutting in and out.
Have you lost me now?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Perhaps you can repeat your comment and hopefully it works this time.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking now about electoral system, how the electoral system can maybe support or help in overcoming winner takes all scenarios. Again, I mentioned maybe a preference for proportional representation, preferential voting systems, and also to reserve seats, of course, for minorities. Also systems that are put in place commonly are, I mean, basically proportional representation enhances also chances for coalition building, also avoiding winner takes all scenarios in the setup of the government, of the executive. I think we should also think about dividing executive powers, maybe between different actors, like a semi-presidential system with the president and the prime minister. There are territorial design options, of course, in the Constitution, whether it is decentralization, is it devolution, or even federal setups. I think especially in the African continent, it's of crucial importance to think also about localizing politics, not only government services, but also politics, and allow strong mechanisms for political decentralization. I think very important also is to provide for an independent arbiter, like to strengthen the justice system and provide for a strong judiciary that is able then to adjudicate political disputes also, rather than allowing sliding back into conflict. So constitutional court models are available and should be strengthened in such scenarios. And I think I would also like to mention a kind of, I mean, this is now unfortunately not very often practiced around the world, but forms of consociational governments, like we have seen in Switzerland or in Lebanon, where government positions are also being rotating between different groups. I think that is something that has not been explored enough also in the African continent, could also be very helpful in scenarios like Somalia, but also in other multi-ethnic contexts like Kenya or Ethiopia, where I think it would be maybe prudent and useful to look into models how executive leadership can rotate also between different actors, political actors in those societies. So I hope the connection hold, and I close here.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Jan. We could hear everything this time. And thank you for your comments on constitutional design and also the point that amendment could help to fill in the gaps from constitution making. So we shouldn't see constitution making processes themselves as needing to cover all aspects within the constitution. Catherine, I have a question with regard to South Sudan, a country you've worked on for a while now, and South Sudan's permanent constitution is now long delayed. And there is a question about timing. It raises the question about timing, which was also raised by Christina herself, I think, and I would want to ask you, is there, and also raised by Adam, is there a form of constitutional moment, so to speak, or can timing itself also be disadvantageous or inimical to the constitution making process?
Thank you very much, Nika. Would you allow me just for a minute to respond to one of the comments that Adam made previously on the Sahel region, which I found really, really interesting?
Yes,
in fact, sorry? In fact, what we have seen in the Sahel region is a number of unconstitutional changes of government and a lot of constitutional processes that were interrupted by such unconstitutional changes of government. For example, in Mali, where a constitutional process was ongoing to implement the prerogatives of the Algiers Peace Agreement of 2015. And repeatedly, constitutional drafts were being developed, and ideas of larger decentralization, etc., were tabled. And it's interesting that after this unconstitutional change of government, also in Mali, a coup, and the point that Adam brought up about a lot of entities, jihadist groups, etc., even rejecting the basic idea of a state, it is often the case, and I've seen it now in several processes, that somehow elites often try as a tool to gain or to reclaim legitimacy, to then call for a national dialogue. And this national dialogue is often not inclusive. It is often also very politically dominated. And this brings me right to the point of South Sudan. This is precisely what happened in South Sudan. A very broad national dialogue. Everyone was invited to join. One of the parties made it clear from the start that they were not going to be part of the national dialogue. And what we see now in this ever-delayed constitution-making process is that somehow the government still refers to the outcome document of the national dialogue as a legitimate document representing the people's will for a future constitutional dispensation in South Sudan, even though large parts of the opposition never took part in that dialogue. So again, how can tools be used and misused in such processes is really, really interesting. And obviously, that the timing of constitution making is really a very delicate balancing act. It's the questions of designing a constitution-making process obviously not only asked by whom and how, but also the important question, when should it happen? And so therefore, one of the most important elements of a constitution-making process, the process design, is really the questions of sequencing, and which is a very crucial discussion to have before the constitution-making process starts, and particularly in post-conflict countries. It's in post-conflict contexts, you often have a constitution-making process and the principles tied to that constitution-making process that are previously agreed in the framework of a peace process. So it's often the terms, as Christina also mentioned, the terms of a peace agreement will often determine how a future constitution will be made. And also very often it's principles, foundational principles that will guide or bind a constitution-making process that are also agreed in peace agreements. If you look, for example, to the Sudan, the Juba Peace Agreement of 2020 has a whole list of fundamental principles that shall be reflected in the future constitutional dispensation of the state. So there are specific starting points for a constitution-making process that often require decisions to be taken before the process itself starts. Be it the negotiated peace, be it the transitional political arrangement, or be it the question, what fundamental principles is this future constitution to honor? What are the specific elements of the constitutional arrangements that should be considered? For example, as Adam also mentioned, the system of government. What do we want? A federal state. So questions like these often are crucial for a successful constitution-making process. And mention the sequencing as it is set up very often sticks to certain timelines, which are often disregarded and which often don't hold. It's always this question about how quickly can a constitution be drafted? How quickly can, a state come to a new constitutional dispensation? And, experience has taught us that generally the timelines are not only unrealistic, but overambitious in that respect. And in a lot of instances lead to delays in this very complex process. An important question that definitely is part of the sequencing element and that comes in also in the example of South Sudan is the question of, with the constitution making process, when do you hold elections? Are the elections before, after? When are the elections to take place? And in South Sudan, you have the particular example of a peace agreement that actually ties the election, the constitution making process and the completed constitution making process as a precondition for elections to take place. So in that sense, you can see that the timing also in holding the constitution making process hostage to to the forthcoming elections potentially is a reason why again, fighting emerges, why people disagree, because of the fact that at a certain point in time in the transitional phase, it is no longer possible to hold both a constitution-making process as well as as an electoral process. And that's currently also the huge question in South Sudan. And this divides largely also the political spectrum in South Sudan, where you have an opposition clearly being fully attached to the timeline outlined in the peace agreement. And on the other hand, political parties who say, let's be, pragmatic, let's hold elections first, let's have the people speak first, and let's then talk about a constitution.
Thank you very much for this. For your insights, Catherine, particularly on the South Sudan situation. And I really liked your points with regard to national dialogues being used by certain groups or elite groups to gain legitimacy. And also the question of sequencing and timelines being even more important than the question of timing per se. These really resonate. Now I could go on asking so many questions to the panel. And however, I am also very aware that we want to open the floor to the audience. So I'm going to ask the panel who are all experts in this field and have a lot to say on this. But can we maybe limit our interventions at this point to a shorter period of time so that we'll be able to open the floor to the audience in the last 30 to 20 minutes of our discussion, of our webinar, if that is possible. But also, I want to come back to Jan and a question about an issue that was raised earlier on in Christina's comments, I think also in Adam, actually in everyone's comments, and I think Jan is gone at this point. So I will then, maybe I would actually pose this question to Christina instead, with regard to political capture. Jan made the comment with regard to, or to elite capture. Jan made the comment earlier that this was, while initially inimical to public participation, it actually helped in propelling the constitutional process forward. What will be your comments with regard to that? You definitely mentioned having more pragmatic perspective on elite participation and elite buy-in as well. But if you would like to expand a little bit on that, that would be highly appreciated.
Help. I mean, Somalia is incredibly complicated, I think, because what I wanted to say earlier also is that sort of incremental process that Jan described so well, which obviously hasn't been ideal, but at least has seen things moving on, kind of is, contradicts what both Adam and I would generally support, and that is grab the moment. And Israel, of course, is an example of an incremental process just not being good enough. Well, many other problems there as well. But I'm not quite sure what to say about the whether we want to call it elite capture or not. I suppose the argument would be that you want a sort of really honest elite that, yes, is going to have interests to protect. But that's sort of just the nature of the world, I suppose. But one hopes is going to pay some attention to the public and then to the broader public. then the question of the political arrangements in a country, it's more than I can answer. I do want to say I worry a little bit about some of Jan's comments. I hope you're there, Jan, on the sort of associational arrangements. Adam and I have a long-standing conversation about how to avoid winner takes all. And although he may not believe this, I do actually generally agree with him about the problem. But I worry that so many of these solutions, especially consociational government, work badly in developed democracies and require a lot of rule following and, in fact, tradition. And how on earth one gets that going in a constitutional arrangement to avoid conflict is difficult. And perhaps we see that a little bit in the developments in Somalia, where these sort of uneasy groups called clans, which seem to be extremely fluid in many ways, can sort of capture, and then minorities within minorities are a problem. But anyhow, that actually goes to constitutional design itself, which I suspect we should not be focusing on today. And I'm dodging your real question.
Completely understand. And actually, we have Jan back at this point, I believe. So Jan, perhaps, I don't know if you heard my question or if I should repeat it. Jan, are you there?
Can you please repeat the question? I was out, yeah.
Yeah, no problem at all. It was a question with regard to your earlier comment on elites, engagement elites. Christina has pointed out the fact that elite capture does, the term elite capture creates a kind of judgment of the process, so to speak, as we would want to have more honest elites. Nevertheless, you talked about the possibility of the influence of the elites actually supporting the process or bringing the process, at least ensuring that the constitution-making process goes ahead. And I was wondering if you could expatiate on that a little bit more.
Yes, sure. I mean, I think it's especially in the Somali context, where Christina is again right there, of course, that it's very difficult even in the Somali context to identify such political elites. I mean, the society is extremely fragmented, and also in the Somali constitution making process, it's quite stunning, to be honest. How then the perspectives actually of the elites were changed after the adoption of the constitution. I mean, basically, we are talking about a group of people that was empowered mainly by, I alluded to this already earlier, by the international community, who said those are now the current political leaders of the country, however they came into place. They need to negotiate now on the outcome of this constitution. And ironically, those elites were very much negotiating the constitution on the basis of their current position at that time. And ironically, this position changed then after the adoption of the constitution. I mean, basically, the Speaker of the Parliament, he became president of a member state, the president of Southwest State. The former Prime Minister, Abdi Gas, he became a minister of Puntland, the Prime Minister of the President of Puntland, also a member state president. And while the president of Galmudug, for example, he became later on a senator, a member of the upper house in Somalia, and the chairman of the Constitutional Oversight Committee. So all the perspectives from that time, when they negotiated only from the perspective of their current position, changed later dramatically when they basically changed shoes and were in the position of the other negotiators. So I'm always saying their karma was a little bit of a bitch, because very often they negotiated even against their own interest, later interests actually in the process. So but I would really like, I mean, maybe let's not go into too much detail there in the Somali clan system and so on. But I mean, the reason why I'm mentioning also consociational forms of government is also in the constitutional design, particularly in the Somali context, is that we have those informal power sharing arrangements within the clans in Somalia, and rotation mechanisms in the presidency, in government positions actually, which are informally and practically applied, but not translated into the constitutional design. And there, from a rule of law perspective and from the idea of constitutionalism, I'm arguing, why are you applying those informal rotation systems? Why don't you translate them also in the constitutional design in order to, as we said also earlier, to lock in also certain achievements of the state building process and translate them also in the constitutional document, which is then also binding going forward. I mean, we have now this example in Puntland, usually.
If I may at this point, sorry, and just so that we don't, I certainly also have comments with regard to the consociational question, but since we're focusing on constitution making processes, I would like to keep this conversation focused on it at this point. Also to give time for the remaining questions that we have for the panel, other members of the panel, and to allow the audience to also speak. So if you might wrap up your comment at this point, and then I also have a question to Adam about internal factors.
Sure, but I mean, what I wanted to say is lock also those practical approaches to peace building that are applied in the Somali context, in the Somali clan system, lock them also in the constitutional text. It doesn't make sense to informally apply them afterwards because you don't want to appreciate the fact that your society is based on clanism and that are the political realities, then also translate it into constitutional design. I think that was my main point I wanted to make.
Thank you so much, Jan, for this. I have a question to Adam, and this also harks back to Christina's keynote, which covered basically my entire list of questions. So thank you very much for this, Christina. But Christina made a point that public participation is necessary, but the constitution-making process cannot be people-driven. And what is actually most needed is an elite pact. This actually usually goes against the grain of what is said what is usually spoken about in practice in constitution making processes, that public participation is of absolute necessity. Do you have any comments on how to balance these two somewhat not necessarily opposing but sometimes in conflict views?
Well, so just to make sure that I'm not misunderstood, and hopefully Christina agrees with me here, I mean that we are not saying that public participation is not important. I think it's very, very important. Ultimately, the Constitution should reflect the heartbeats of the public, because otherwise, whoever does not like the outcome, does not like the constitutional framework, can use the popular dissatisfaction to launch challenge to it, fundamental challenge, violent challenge to it. So it is very important to have the buy-in of the public, right? But at the same time, I think it should not take precedence over the importance of elites. Now, we are not talking about angels here, right? They are not angels, and so we have to constrain them, and we have to find ways to make sure that even when they pursue their self-interests, that collectively advance the common interest. I mean, at the same time, I think we should not see elites as only crooks, right? And so they have ideas, they have interests, some of them legitimate, and they also have differences in terms of their competence, in terms of their integrity, and in terms of the way they present things and the strategies that they have. And so it's very important not to use public participation to either undermine the value of or otherwise exclude the importance of elite consensus. And I will speak to two important issues in this regard. And the first one is that, as Christina said, when you engage people, the tendency is either to talk about substantive issues, like rights issues and all, or often issues that are adjacent to the constitutional dispensation, often focused on governance. They want service delivery. They want inflation to be managed. They want their kids to be safe, right? And these are governance issues. These are issues that a working public system, bureaucracy, should be able to handle. But the fundamental, the bread and butter of the constitutional dispensation is the institutional structure, right? And in that regard, often it is the elites. So you can't pursue the same objectives through different institutional arrangements, and that is where the elite differences are. And so I think if we consider the constitutional framework as important in articulating the institutional architecture, we have to emphasize on the elite aspect of it. That's one. And the second point is that sometimes we think that the public preferences and public participation is critical, and it is, but oftentimes there is an extensive diffusion of interests, right? So it's very difficult to say this is what the public wants. That's one. The second thing is that, and unfortunately, we've seen it in the Gambia, for instance, is that the people may express support for certain important things. There may be difference on a lot of issues, but on certain things, for instance, in the Gambia, on term limits, there was very, very wide, broad consensus. And what happens, unfortunately, when the government actually then sort of reneges on its promise, it doesn't get punished. It doesn't pay for it, right? And so if we want public participation to be critical, ultimately, there has to be a way to send the message that if you don't include what we want, you will pay for it in the next elections when we get the chance. And so just to bring all of that together, I think, especially if we see the substance institutional distinction in a constitutional framework, elite consensus is absolutely critical on the institutional aspect, which I think are crucial. And of course, the Constitution also should provide for mechanisms for a sort of continuous public engagement, so that it comes alive as it gets interpreted and reinterpreted and implemented by the people. But I think an undue emphasis on public participation can take the edge, as I said. It can take the process out of the impetus that is necessary. When you think that you have your back against the wall, you are more likely to act. And time, unfortunately, tends to take that edge off of the mark. And of course, time also means new challenge, new problems will emerge, new things that require our attention. And ordinary politics will interfere in the consensus and public deliberation that is necessary to advance the constitution making process. So we need them both. But I think if we must emphasize on the elites and as Christina said, bringing in a mechanism where the public actually buys into the framework, so that recalcitrant actors don't use that absence of an ideal form of public participation to undermine and challenge the broader framework in illegal ways.
Okay, thank you, Adam. That was quite an amount to unpack with regard to public participation, but you made some really interesting points, that it's necessary for buy-in, definitely. But one thing we should note, and two critical points with regards to public participation, is that it often focuses on governance questions, and there is such a diffusion of interest. We can't normally say this is what the public actually wants. And also there is no possibility, or so far there hasn't been any mechanism developed to hold the elites to account when they do not follow up on what the public has required. These are really key points that I would love to get back into. Unfortunately, we do not have time. And at this point, actually, I think I'm going to go directly to the final section of questions with regard to constitution making, just to give the members of the audience time to also pose their questions. And this goes to Christina as well as to all members of the panel. We've certainly unpacked constitution making in this discussion so far and looked at the various aspects of it. But going into not going into 2025, we're already far into 2025, and going into 2026, we have a number of constitutional processes ahead of us. And we also, so My question to you would be, what are your recommendations? What do you think would be the positives going forward? So maybe we can round up this discussion in a positive note, if possible. I have a question mark at the end of that, but if it's possible, it would be interesting to hear your points as to what should be focused on when we go into constitution making processes in various countries across Africa. And I understand that there's a lot of context that is important as well. So, however, if you could outline some general principles or adjustments to principles that we so far have held as sacrosanct, that would actually be very helpful. And perhaps Christina can go first, then we will have Jan, Adam, then Catherine to round up.
Well, again, these are really difficult questions. But I do think, and I think it's actually emerged from what everyone has said here, that the design of a constitution-making process matters. Leaving aside the complicated paradox of democracy, that you can't decide the design, you can't always decide the design democratically, leave that aside, but how you design it matters. And then as Jan really showed with the complicated Somali example, context will determine that finally. We can't sort of say this is ideal. I think we agree, though, that we need an elite deal. Public participation should be an element, but needs to be managed really carefully and involve listening and responding as well, so that the public sees that their input is used and is engaged with, and their ways of doing that. Then transparency, and as Katrine added to my sort of list, of course, access to information. I think those are sort of two sides of the same coin, that people need to know what's going on. And we've learned those things. And as I said earlier, I do think that engaging in all of those things can potentially help build democracy. In addition, one hopes, to building a good constitution. I do believe engaging properly with the public and with interest groups. I mean, interest groups outside the sort of core political elite can strengthen a constitution. Something I didn't say that I think is really important is that the public and NGOs and civil society should actually pay attention to the detail of the constitution, as well as the big issues like, let's take Gambia, secularism and term limits. Because many of those detailed issues, and one of my pet subjects is the Director of Public Prosecutions, are really crucial in holding a constitution together in the long run. And it always surprises me how little attention is paid to that by the public in engaging with constitutional processes. So that's just a random number of things. Another issue, though, is this complicated thing of referendums. I'm cynical about referendums. I worry about them because they can be so dangerous. But of course, and Kenya again is an example of this, they can operate as what has been called a downstream constraint. And that may well have been the case in the Kenyan process, when the politicians got to the point of deciding on the draft constitution that they were presented with. My Kenyan colleagues, at least, were pretty convinced that there were some elements the politicians felt they couldn't touch because of the downstream constraint of a referendum. So, there's one of those design issues that is possibly worth considering. Is that optimistic? I'm not sure. It does mean, though, if we pay a lot of attention and all the other circumstances are right, maybe we can get somewhere.
That was certainly very optimistic. Was optimistic enough, I would say. Yes. Jan, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think also echoing now what we discussed earlier is I think we have to, of course, accept that political bargaining, especially in post-conflict scenarios, will very often prevail in the process. And I think we have to respect that also in terms of ownership of the countries, especially as external support actors. I think we have to respect the political culture and the political realities that this constitutional process unfolds in. And we should there prioritize definitely local needs over international agendas, and especially when it comes to content. And I think international support should focus there probably more on process rather than outcomes and substantial points. And I think that is maybe also an issue with this international support community on constitution making, that very often, because it's of course more sexy, more interesting also for constitutional drafters to be involved directly in the drafting process and in the political debates and inform political debates. But I think very often you see that external actors do more harm than they actually help in those substantial debates in a specific country. So I think going forward, and that is maybe also echoing again what we said, that public participation and inclusivity is so important. If we acknowledge this, I think going forward, much more emphasis should be given on how to improve the quality of the process rather than inform the substantial discussions of a process. What I mean with that, I think much more emphasis should be given into how to ensure genuine public participation, explore new models and multiple platforms now, especially now in this terms of digitalization, where even in Somalia, many people have access to phones and internet and could be involved in innovative processes which could collect also views from a wide range of people in Somalia in the most remote areas even. I think we should avoid, we should maybe put more emphasis there also in civic education, rather informing now the political debates in the country. We should really focus how can we make those debates relevant for the people and make people understand how maybe their ideas can also help in shaping the governance structure for their country in the future. I think we should also focus on things that naturally political actors will disregard. Very often those political elites will not be so super interested in broadcasting their debates or in transparency of their debates. So I'm thinking of putting more efforts also to try to get constitutional debates in a constitution-making process to the public, again, using maybe new forms of digital access that is possible in this 21st century. And but then also maybe try to support also some of the still substantive questions, but always work and promote inclusivity in democratic institutions, ensure representation of women, youth and minorities in political bodies. Of course, this is where emphasis should and is needed, should be placed and is needed. Maybe also on working on quotas or, as I said now, preferential voting systems, ensuring that later on the political pact is informed at least with models and ideas that ensure democratic principles going forward. And then last but not least, also emphasis needs to be put, I think, on post-adoption implementation, to have also mechanisms now, again, like an independent judiciary, maybe also independent institutions which help seeing now the implementation of the process of the constitutional document that has been adopted, and that legislation and institutions later on align also to the new constitutional document. And also there, in order to keep also the constitutional debate and the state building process, especially in post-conflict scenarios, alive, invest also post-adoption in civic education and promote the idea of constitutionalism and rule of law in those countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. Jan, Adam, you have the floor. We can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Perfect. No, this was the feast. As always, I come to speak and I leave taking a lot of insights and ideas with me. Overall, I think, as Christina said, the process matters. And in a way, the key aspect of that, and there is a new scholarship now, is the sense that it's fair, that overall there's a sort of a balance of power, a balance of access, a balance of influence for the most important ideas, the most important stakeholders, and the most important interests. And so I think we cannot just start a process and push it through, right? And it matters also how the process itself is designed. And so who designs it, right? And so you can't, even if it's a great process, if it's one actor who happens to be in the top leadership imposing it on others, it will not work. It will undermine trust, which is critical for the entire process. So how the process is important, but who designs it and how is also important. We don't need a perfect balance, but there has to be a sense that everybody has had a fair chance. That's one. And the second one is that I think we also need to recognize the change in circumstances. In the 90s, when all of this was big, often you have to move essentially from nothing to something. Right? In South Africa, you needed a constitution, right? And so there was essentially, an interim constitution, but it was there was agreement that something new had to come, right? The same in Namibia and in a lot of places. So what was there was extremely discredited, and therefore a new thing was inevitable, right? And so even if it takes 1 year or 2 years, you know that something was going to come. What we are grappling with today is very different. There is something already, and there's a lot of interest around it. It may not be perfect, but there are some functioning elements in the constitutional arrangements, even in places that are in trouble, right? There are troubled places like Chad or Mali or South Sudan and Somalia. And so we have to start thinking of constitution making as a sort of eternal relay, right? And so we don't have to do everything now. And in any case, as Christina said, the last time a democratic, inclusive process succeeded was in Zimbabwe, in Tunisia. And you know how in 2014, that was the last constitution that was adopted through an inclusive process in Africa. So it has been more than a decade since an inclusive process has actually led to a new constitution, right? And unfortunately, for various reasons, it didn't work. And so the lesson there is, as Christina said, we can consider constitution making as a sort of a relay, find solutions, some of the key issues in moments, in chunks, in manageable chunks, and hopefully the next generation will take it. And so that is how the democratic frameworks that we idealize emerged, right? So no political system goes from 0 to 100. It's very rare that happens. So we have to accept that it's an eternal process, that we have to experiment, make change, adapt as we go. And that also reduces the stakes, right? And so if we're changing some things at a particular time, that reduces the stakes of change, which will hopefully lead to more trust, more engagement, more deliberation, and hopefully lays the background for better kind of politics going forward.
Thank you very much, Adam. And Catherine, the floor is yours as well.
Yes, most of the things have already been said by Jan and Adam. One thing that I really think is important to mention, we didn't have time to discuss this in detail, but one thing that is really crucial for me is the role of international engagement in these constitution-making processes. And I think there also we all have to critically reflect upon the well-intentioned constitutional assistance and whether it really provides the assistance that is needed for the country. Any international involvement, any external involvement is never impact neutral on the society, on the constitution-making process. There's always an impact. International involvement always has a clear purpose and a target audience. So therefore, I do think we talk about what we need to do in the constitution-making process all through this webinar, but I do think we should also think about the question of, what is our legitimacy in getting involved in these processes, and what is the harm that can be done by an external or international-led constitution-making process. I know that international assistance happens in various forms and various degrees, and is beneficial in many, many respects, but there are limits to it. And I do think moving forward, this is a debate that must be held with every constitution-making process that a country embarks on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and to Christina and all the panelists. I think I will do a huge disservice to all your comments if I were to try and sum up, but I will still try my best. And so first, I will mention the fact that Christina highlighted the importance of transparency and information. And the point from Jan, or sentence from Jan, which I found really interesting, was international actors should support process over the outcome, which is also was also echoed in Catherine's comments that there is the possibility of doing harm. There's a real possibility of doing harm with international engagement, and it will be really important for international actors to ensure that they are looking at the process rather, or they're supporting the process. Adam's point about the process mattering, it was also quite interesting and resonating, and that constitutional making could be seen as more of a relay, which can be done over time, and in that way, therefore, reducing the stakes amongst the parties, which and also the necessity for balancing actors and their influence. So I thank you all for your comments up to this point. I think we have a question or a comment in the chat already. Thank you, Nancy. She says that Christina mentioned, so just to mention, we're going directly into the audience questions. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat like Nancy did, or you can also raise your hands. There is a hand raising function within Zoom, and I will call on you. But with regard to Nancy's comment, she says that Christina mentioned a controlled public participation, which, and I don't quite understand what that means. I have this belief that public participation brings about legitimacy. Can this be clarified, please? So Christina, the floor is yours.
Okay, very briefly, the idea of control doesn't really mean, as it may sound, I now realize, kind of managed and controlled in an oppressive way. All I really want to draw attention to is that, I mean, public participation can actually get violent, and there are many examples of that. People involved in public participation can deliberately exclude groups. There are all kinds of things that can go on. And in building a public participation process, one of course wants something as open as possible, and social media and so on make that really quite exciting nowadays. But one needs to be really aware of those things. The question of the degree to which public participation builds legitimacy is just one that I find quite difficult. I think it may, but it may not. It may at least build legitimacy, for instance, in the short term, that the process has more credibility because people have actually been involved. And I think importantly, because they see that their contributions have been taken into account. I think that's really, really an important part of a public participation process. There are many stories of submissions just ending up in a sort of back room in an unruly pile. And there are ways of taking what the public has contributed into account, engaging with it and explaining why you accept and don't accept things. So I think that can build legitimacy of both public participation and the process itself. Whether that legitimacy, if indeed it's there, lasts into the long term to secure the Constitution better is at best an open question. I think that really in the longer term, it's the delivery of the Constitution, its effectiveness and so on, in producing stability and accountable government and protecting rights is what is crucial. Thanks. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much, Christina, for this response. We also have a question from someone at the Lexlata Center who asks, how can drafters of constitutions balance speed to prevent renewed violence with inclusivity? And this is a question of with regard to timing that we also raised earlier on. And I think Adam and Catherine had made points in this regard, and also Jan, I believe. So if any one of you would like to respond to this question, perhaps I can open the floor to Adam, and then Catherine, if you would like to jump in, or Jan, that would also be possible.
Well, so I'm not sure if I captured the entire the entire question. But I think when balance, I think should be a fundamental principle of life, as it is for constitution making processes. And perfect balance is obviously impossible. There are some actors that are more organized, more resourceful, and especially the incumbents in the context that we're talking about. The incumbents just tend to have the resources, the network, the state apparatus, the international recognition, and access to what comes with it. And so, if we don't try to balance that imbalance, even if the outcome, even if what emerged out of that process can be seen, can be justified, can be explained, the sense that it was fair, that everybody had the chance to make their case, that they have been heard properly, will be lower, right? And so we have to make sure and create, and it's impossible, right? I think it's impossible, as I said, to create perfect balance, but we have to use public participation, civil society organizations, and when used genuinely, international actors to create a slightly better level field for the various actors, because otherwise, as I said, the process itself will be delegitimized. That can then lead to a rejection of the outcome and either a continuity of insecurity or relapse to this insecurity, as the case may be. So, as I said, I think I consider it an important part of principle of life, and we should certainly use that as part of constitution make process as well.
Thank you very much, Adam. Jan, Catherine, would either one of you want to also respond to this? We have a further question in the chat as well. So if you want to...
I would like to say very briefly that I'm not so sure that, especially in the Somali case, I would not agree that the need for speed had to do a lot with to prevent renewed violence, even in this post-conflict scenario. What I sense more, and I'm sure that the others can also confirm that from their experiences, the need for speed or for time pressure, timelines, very often is determined also by external interests, very often by, especially in the African continent and also in post-conflict scenarios, by donor interests who want to see results now. And I think this is what I meant also earlier before, where I think we need to focus maybe as external support community, we need to invest much more in the process rather than the outcome of a constitution-making process, because I think it would be much more important to work towards an inclusive process rather than on timelines that are predetermined by donor funding, by maybe shifting interests then from the international community now again to other constitution-making processes and so on. So I think I would definitely always, of course, if it was supposed to prevent renewed violence, I would accept the argument for speed, but I would really warn against timelines that are determined by external actors and external interests that very often don't help, especially a constitution-making process in a post-conflict scenario.
Thank you, Jan. Catherine, do you also want to respond to this question? Please go ahead.
Very briefly only, yes, I do also think that the question of timelines and imposed timelines is a tricky one. What I think is, yes, constitutional process design is an important element and a very crucial element. Nevertheless, any constitutional process should contain a certain degree of flexibility to respond to the political reality of the developments in the country, and thereby not stick to a fixed timeline and a fixed process from the very start. And what is essential also in that sense is when the constitution-making process reaches a standstill, a deadlock, to find or to agree on before the constitution-making process happens, deadlock-breaking mechanisms that move the process forward, because this is often what causes delays, is a complete standstill in the discussions, the negotiations. Find ways how to break a deadlock if it occurs. That might also then, save a lot of time in this process.
Thank you very much, Catherine. We move on to another question. Well, actually, there are two questions in one. And I would pose this to the entire panel. First of all, what needs to come first in the state building process? So expanding beyond constitution making, and whether constitution making should come first or elections or so forth. What will be the opinion of the panel and the keynote speaker? And there is a second question. How can African diaspora influence the constitution-making processes in their countries, home countries, I would assume? So perhaps I will open the floor first to Christina, and then we can go through the panelists, and you can either respond to both questions or to one or the other. And then I believe we'll hand over, if there are no further questions, we'll hand over to the Lexlata Center.
Okay, if I may, just a quick word on timelines, sort of building on, I think it was Katrine's point. Of course, timelines are often imposed by the international community, and for sort of some good and some not good reasons. And I think often they're very seldom kept. They're often introduced very early, but at a certain point, I do believe they can be useful, because constitution makers have many reasons, including their daily allowances, to sit around for a very long time to make their decisions. So they shouldn't be completely rejected at the right time, with the right flexibility built in. So setting that aside, on the constitutions versus elections first issue, I mean, again, context matters. But if we think of situations in which one moves from a peace process, one clearly needs some form of constitutional arrangement for that interim period. And if one fears that an election will lead to a kind of winner-take-all outcome, one needs some kind of way of securing some constitutional elements before elections, perhaps. It's one of the reasons I think that in quite a lot of context, the two-stage process South Africa undertook, and Namibia, for example, and actually perhaps even Germany way back, is to sort of bind the constitution making, tie constitution makers' hands, as I described it earlier, and then possibly have elections and a constitution. I think that might work in South Sudan, but the South Sudanese are very unwilling to engage in anything at all, it seems, let alone developing a sort of more staggered process. That I hope sort of answers.
Thank you very much. It does, Christina. I think we can go in the other direction that we had earlier on. So Catherine can respond first, and then Adam, and then Jan.
Thank you very much, Nika. I'm afraid I will not have anything probably to contribute on the African diaspora, as I'm clearly, I mean, that is something that needs to come from people directly affected by it. And also context matters, how big is the diaspora? How much influence does it generate, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question, but I do echo a lot of the points that Christina just said. And I think it is important when deciding between elections and the constitution-making process that, well, as we saw, a two-stage process, a lot of countries also resort to transitional arrangements, transitional constitutions, then hold elections, and then come to a more permanent arrangement. There needs to be some sort of constitutional agreement in order to move to elections. People must know what form of government they will be voting for, who will be, what kind of elections are we holding. There needs to be some sort of agreement on the basis. And I think that is often provided by a transitional constitutional arrangement that precedes a permanent constitution.
Thank you, Catherine. Adam?
Well, on the diaspora point, just quickly, I mean, as Catherine said, it depends, of course. But in places where there is a significant diaspora community, I think there is an important case for their participation. They have a direct interest, their families live there, they often have properties, investments. And so what happens in that country is of great stake for them. And therefore, I think they should have a say in how the political institutions, the fundamental rights, and the entire state apparatus is structured. And so there's no question about that. The how, again, depends. I think I must say often they are more privileged, right? So they have access, for instance, to the internet. They have access to examples of organization and all. And so I think it's very important to recognize that. So the exact methodology will depend. Well, that's one. And the second one is we have to recognize the diaspora, just like the society, is not the same, right? So there is different interests, there's diversities within the diaspora, such that we have to provide mechanisms to create awareness among everybody so that they can share their ideas. And of course, diasporas also have more experience, right? So they have more comparative insights. And therefore, they can be, they don't only have interest, but they can also be significant resources for a particular country. So the how and all the details will depend, but there's no question that they should be involved. And then quickly on the point that Christina and Catherine, when I hear about the fair question debate, I sometimes think, think about elections as a game, right? And constitutions or constitutional frameworks are the rules. Now, you cannot play a game without rules. It's as simple as that. Right? So you can call it transitional constitution, you can call it whatever, but you need rules. If you're going to play the game of elections, who is going to be the referee? And how are you going to translate voter support into power? How do you translate that? What kind of powers, what kind of institutions, what will they do when they are elected? All of that needs to be regulated. That is the constitution, right? And so whatever the name we give it, and I think the distinction between transitional and permanent, it's often confusing. There's no such thing as a permanent constitution. And so all constitutions are transitional in the sense because they can be changed at any time. So unless there is a time frame which says, at this point, this constitution dies, there's no constitution that is transitional, right? Until it's replaced, it's permanent. So in that sense, if we think about it as in the form of games and rules, right, I think it's clear, it's easier. You cannot play, imagine playing football without a referee and without rules. It cannot happen. And so we need a framework for that. And therefore, rules must always precede, in my opinion, fundamental rules at least must precede the game.
Thank you for this, Adam. We're already over time by a minute, but I would still give the floor to Jan for a final comment with regard to this question before we hand over to the Lexlata Center.
Yes, thank you so much, Nika. Yeah, I mean, I find it also a funny question. I'm not surprised by the answers when you ask for constitutional lawyers. What needs to come first, constitution or election? Of course, we strongly believe that constitutional framework needs to provide for the ground rules for such an election. But I think also maybe now to a nice twist to the end, what I hear very often from the community that is supporting democratization and elections in Africa, also in Somalia, is how can you come to a constitution if you don't have democratically legitimized leaders? And it's related also to the question of democratic constitution making. But I think, yeah, I mean, my co-panelists have already answered to this. I think the solution would be kind of an interim arrangement to provide the ground rules, see the constitution maybe as a work in progress, go to elections, and then move towards a more democratic, legitimized constitution-making process.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this, Jan, and to Christina and our panelists, Catherine, Adam, Jan. My thanks for participating in this and for your very, very lively and active discussion. At this, I would also like to thank the audience for staying with us to this point and also for your very insightful comments and questions. Unfortunately, we could not get to all the questions, but nevertheless, what we could cover was really interesting and also furthered our discussion as well. At this point, I would like to hand over to Wale at Lexlata Center for him to round up and close this webinar. Wale, if we still have you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nneka. It's been a very excellent webinar. The speakers have covered a wider range of topics in this area, are very important topics, actually. One thing that I think was mentioned a lot in the course of the discussions is pragmatism, the importance of pragmatism in the constitution-making process. And I think this is a very important theme. Why? Because the general belief, the general notion is that when you're talking about democratic constitution making, it should be founded on public participation, extensive public participation, the sort that the type that we had in South Africa, you know, in the 1990s. But then there's also the need to include the elite because what we've seen is that in most cases, excessive idealism often stalls the constitution-making process. What we then need to do is to try to strike a balance between the need to ensure elite consensus and the need to ensure that the general public or ordinary citizens also have a say in what should be contained in the constitution. Now, how to strike that balance? It's the very difficult point, and I think this will depend on the nature of politics in different jurisdictions and the sort of arrangements that they have in those jurisdictions. But it's been a very wonderful webinar, and I know going forward we have a lot to think about on what constitution making should look like in Africa. Thank you very much to all our speakers. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Sam. It's been Adam, sorry. It's been a wonderful webinar. Before we go, I should quickly mention that we'll be having the Lexlata Center is organizing a constitution making course sometime in September. We were supposed to have it this August, but we wanted to have this webinar before the course. So we'll be having the course in September. Details of that will be posted on our social media platforms in the coming days. Once again, thank you very much to everyone that has participated in this very important discussion. Thank you very much to the audience. Thank you to the speakers. And thank you very much, Nneka, for moderating very excellently. Thank you so much. I think we've come to the end of this event. I wish all of you a very pleasant weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Have a
Thanks,
good weekend.
everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.